My grandmother kept a feeding schedule beside her bed for nearly 40 years. She never owned a pet. I found the logbook the second day after I moved into her house. 312 pages of tide times, moon phases, and amounts weighed to the pound. I wish I could tell you I put it down and walked away. I wish I could tell you I drove back to Connecticut that night and never thought about it again. But I didn't. And now I keep the schedule too. My name is Arthur Marsh. I am 66 years old, though I feel considerably older since last October. I retired from teaching in 2022 after 37 years of standing in front of classrooms full of children who would rather be anywhere else. The retirement had not gone the way I imagined. I had pictured reading, long walks, perhaps finally learning to cook something other than pasta and canned sauce. What I got instead was silence. My house in Connecticut was a 3-bedroom colonial that I had bought when I still believed I might fill it with a family, and each empty room echoed with the particular hollowness of a life lived mostly alone. My wife, Karen, had left in 2004. No children, no drama. She simply said one evening that she could not spend another decade with a man who was more comfortable with books than with people, and I had not been able to argue the point. I filled my days with routine. Coffee at 6, a walk at 7, the newspaper, which I still received in print because the ritual of unfolding it mattered more than the news. Lunch alone. An afternoon in the garden or the library. Dinner alone. Bed by 9. It was not an unhappy life, but it was a small one, and it was getting smaller. My grandmother, Edna Holloway, lived alone in a house on the coast of Maine, just outside a town called Redfern. Not the tourist stretch of Maine with the lobster shacks and painted buoys hanging from gift shop walls. The other part. The part where the shore is all black rock, and the trees grow sideways from the wind, and the fog comes in so thick you can taste the salt on your tongue before you can see your own hands. She died at 94, sharp as a blade until the last week. The hospital called me on a Tuesday. She had listed me as next of kin, which surprised me because we were not close. I visited her perhaps twice a year, dutifully, and each visit felt like an obligation we both endured with polite discomfort. She would make tea. I would ask about her garden. She would ask about my students. We would sit in her kitchen and listen to the wind press against the windows, and after an hour I would leave feeling vaguely guilty without understanding why. I had no siblings. My mother, Edna's only daughter, died when I was 19. A car accident on a January road, black ice on a bridge she had crossed 1,000 times. My father followed 3 years later from what the doctors called heart failure, and what I understood to be grief. Edna was the last of my family, and when she went, I was alone in a way that I had not quite prepared for. The funeral was small. A minister I did not know read passages. Edna had selected herself. Psalms about the sea giving up its dead and waters that cannot quench. 6 people attended, including me. Claire from the general store was there, and Haskell the lawyer, and 3 elderly men I did not recognize who stood at the back of the church and left before I could introduce myself. They walked out together, shoulders hunched, and did not speak to each other or to anyone else. I watched them from the church steps as they climbed into a pickup truck and drove away toward the coast road, and I remember thinking that they moved like men carrying something heavy that no one else could see. The lawyer called the day after the funeral. His name was Haskell, and he had practiced in Redfern for longer than I had been alive. Edna had left me everything. The house, the land, a modest savings account, and a storage unit in town that I did not know she had. Haskell's voice was careful on the phone, measured in the way people sound when they are trying to say something without actually saying it. He mentioned that the house would need attention, that it had certain requirements. I asked him what he meant. He paused for a long time, long enough that I heard him clear his throat twice. Then he said the property was held under an old covenant attached to the land, and there were obligations I should understand. I should come see for myself. I drove up from Connecticut on a Friday in late October. The trees along the interstate were bare already. stripped early by a nor'easter that had come through the week before, and the landscape had that bleak November look despite it still being October. By the time I crossed into Maine, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the radio had turned to static between stations that grew further and further apart. Redfern sat at the end of a 2-lane road that followed the coast for about 12 miles past the last real town. There was a gas station with one working pump, a post office the size of a garden shed, a general store with a hand-painted sign that said Redfern Provisions, in letters that had faded to near invisibility, and a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east. I had seen that steeple dozens of times over the years, but it struck me differently now. It looked like something that had been listening to the ocean for too long and had grown tired of standing straight. There were no tourists. There were no seasonal residents putting up their shutters. The few people I saw moved with the deliberate unhurriedness of those who had nowhere else to be and nowhere else they wanted to go. Edna's house was another 3 miles past Redfern, down a gravel road that cut through dense spruce forest before opening onto a clearing above the water. The house itself was a Cape Cod, white clapboard, gone gray from the salt air, with black shutters and a steep roof. It was larger than I remembered. 2 stories, plus a cellar door set into the foundation on the north side. A stone chimney climbed the east wall, and the windows reflected the overcast sky like blind eyes. I parked and sat in the car for a moment, listening. The wind was steady out of the northeast, carrying the smell of kelp and cold stone. Beneath the wind, I could hear the water. Not crashing, not the dramatic surf you hear in movies, just a slow, rhythmic pressure against the rocks below the bluff. A patient sound. A sound that had been repeating itself long before the house was built and would continue long after the house was gone. The key was under a stone frog beside the front steps, exactly where she had always kept it. The door opened with the sound of swollen wood releasing, and I stepped into a smell I recognized immediately. Lavender sachets and wood polish, and something else underneath, something briny and deep that I had always assumed was simply the proximity to the ocean. Standing in that doorway, breathing it in, I was not so sure. The house was clean. Unnervingly so, for a place whose owner had been dead for 2 weeks. The kitchen counters were wiped down. The floors were swept. The dishes were put away, each plate and cup in its proper place as though she might walk in at any moment and reach for them. I checked the refrigerator and found it empty, except for a box of baking soda and a jar of something dark and viscous that I could not identify. The jar had no label. I held it up to the light, and the contents shifted like oil, but thicker. I left it alone. I carried my bag upstairs to the guest bedroom. The bed was made with fresh sheets, tucked with hospital corners the way Edna had always done them. I stood in the doorway and wondered who had done that, and when, and why. The house had been locked. The key had been under the frog. No one should have been inside since the ambulance came. The house settled around me as the temperature dropped outside. Old houses make sounds, and I was accustomed to that. The creak of joists, the tick of cooling pipes, the whisper of wind finding gaps in the caulking. But Edna's house made sounds I was not accustomed to. A low, intermittent thrumming that seemed to come from beneath the floor. Not mechanical exactly, but rhythmic. I told myself it was the pipes. The plumbing was old. Pipes make noises. I walked through each room that first evening, turning on lights, opening closets, running my hand along surfaces I remembered from childhood visits. The living room had the same braided rug, the same wingback chair by the fireplace, the same shelves of hardcover books that smelled of mildew and old glue. Edna had read voraciously. Histories, mostly. Maritime disasters, polar expeditions, accounts of deep-sea exploration. The kind of books that concern themselves with what happens to people who go too far from shore. On the mantel above the fireplace, I found a row of framed photographs. Edna and my grandfather on their wedding day, 1957, both of them squinting into the sun. My mother, as a girl, standing on the bluff with the ocean behind her, her hair blown sideways by the wind, and one I had never seen before. An older woman, in a dark dress, standing on rocks at the waterline, facing away from the camera. She was looking at something in the water. The photograph was faded and spotted with age, and on the back, in pencil, someone had written, "Margaret, 1892. My great-great-grandmother, standing on the same rocks where I would soon learn to carry fish in the dark." The bathroom upstairs had a medicine cabinet full of the ordinary supplies of an elderly woman living alone. Aspirin, bandages, reading glasses in 3 different strengths. But in the back, behind the aspirin, I found a bottle of iodine tablets and a tube of burn cream that had been used down to a thin sliver. The burn cream was the kind prescribed for chemical burns, not thermal. I did not understand its significance until much later. I unpacked, made myself a sandwich from the bread and cold cuts I had brought, and sat at the kitchen table as the light faded outside the windows. The sun set early that time of year, and by 5 the kitchen was dark enough that I needed the overhead light. It buzzed when I turned it on, a faint electrical hum that harmonized oddly with the thrumming from below. I washed my plate and dried it and put it in the cupboard where it belonged, because that is what you do in someone else's house, even when that someone is dead and the house is now yours. I stood at the kitchen sink looking out the window toward the water. The bluff dropped away about 40 yards from the house, and beyond it there was nothing but the Atlantic, gray and flat and enormous. The horizon was invisible, the sky and water merging into a single plane of dull silver. Something moved in the water. I saw it from the corner of my eye, a dark shape that broke the surface for perhaps half a second before submerging again. It was large. I told myself it was a seal. Seals were common along that part of the coast. I had seen them before, their round heads bobbing like dark stones, but seals surface with a certain rhythm, a roll and a breath and a dive. What I had seen moved differently. It moved laterally, cutting through the surface the way a hand moves under a bedsheet, fluid and deliberate and very, very long. I pulled the curtain closed and went upstairs. I found the logbook on my second day in the house. I had spent the morning going through Edna's belongings methodically, starting with the living room and working my way through closets and cabinets. She had been organized in the way that very old people sometimes are, as though she had spent her last years making sure everything was in its place for whoever came after. The bedroom drawer was unremarkable. Reading glasses, a tube of hand cream, a rosary I had never seen her use, and the logbook. It was a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and it was full. Every page was covered in her handwriting, which was small and precise and had not wavered even in her final entries. The first page was dated January of 2019. The entries were structured identically. Each one listed a date, a time, the tide level, the moon phase, and then a line that read simply, "Fed," followed by an amount. The amounts were in pounds. January 3rd. High tide, 6:47 in the evening. Waning crescent. Fed. 12 pounds. January 10th. High tide, 11:22 in the evening. First quarter. Fed. 12 pounds. January 19th. High tide, 4:08 in the morning. Full moon. Fed. 20 pounds. The pattern was consistent. Feedings happened at high tide, roughly every 7 to 10 days. The amount was usually 12 pounds, except on full moons, when it doubled. Some entries had additional notes. Restless tonight. Came close to the rocks. Could hear it breathing. I sat on the edge of her bed and turned pages for a long time. The logbook covered nearly 5 years. Hundreds of entries. Each one the same careful notation of tides and weights and moon phases. Each one that single word. Fed. My grandmother had never owned a pet. No dog, no cat, no livestock. The house had no barn, no coop, no kennel. She had a garden, but you do not feed a garden 12 pounds of anything at high tide in the dark. I set the logbook down and went to the cellar. The cellar door on the north side of the house was padlocked. The key was not on Edna's key ring, and I spent an hour searching before I found it in a small wooden box on the top shelf of her bedroom closet, behind a stack of folded quilts. The box also contained a flashlight with fresh batteries, a pair of heavy rubber gloves that were stiff with dried salt, and a folded piece of paper that I did not read until later. The padlock was stiff, but turned. The The door opened outward on rusted hinges, and a smell came up from below that made me step back and cover my mouth with my sleeve. It was not the smell of rot, exactly. It was the smell of the ocean, concentrated into a closed space. Brine and iodine, and the sweet, thick scent of something organic that had been wet for far too long. Beneath that, a faint musk that I could not place, animal and ancient. Wooden stairs descended into the dark. The steps were damp, each one bowed in the center from decades of use. I turned on the flashlight and went down. The cellar was larger than the footprint of the house. It extended back into the bedrock of the bluff, the walls transitioning from poured concrete to rough, dark stone. The floor was damp everywhere, water seeping through cracks in the rock and pooling in shallow depressions that had been worn smooth by years of drainage. The air was colder than it should have been, even for a cellar in Maine. My breath came out in thin clouds. Against the far wall, I found what she had been using. A chest freezer, old and humming, plugged into an extension cord that ran along the ceiling and up through a hole in the floor above. I opened it. Inside were vacuum-sealed bags of fish. Whole fish, gutted and scaled, packed in neat rows. Dozens of them. Cod and haddock and some larger specimens I could not identify, dark-fleshed and heavy-bodied, with blunt heads and small eyes. Beside the freezer was a plastic bin containing a bathroom scale, a filleting knife, a pair of long-handled tongs, and a coil of heavy rope. There was also a headlamp, the kind with an elastic strap, stiffened by salt and age until it barely stretched. I counted the fish in the freezer. There was enough for perhaps 3 months of feedings at the rate documented in the logbook. I stood in that cellar with the flashlight beam trembling in my hand and listened to the sound of water seeping through the stone. Beneath the seeping, beneath the hum of the freezer, I could hear something else. A slow, low pulsing, like a heartbeat transmitted through rock. It was coming from deeper in the cellar, from the point where the stone walls narrowed into a passage that continued back into the bluff. I did not go down that passage, not that day. Upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the piece of paper from the wooden box. It was a letter, addressed to me in Edna's handwriting. Steady, deliberate, each letter formed as though she had all the time in the world to write it. Arthur. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the responsibility falls to you. I am sorry for that. I have maintained the schedule for 41 years, since my own mother passed it to me, and she maintained it for 38 years before that. It must not be interrupted. The consequences of interruption are described in the older book, which you will find in the passage below the cellar. I urge you not to read that book until you have made your first feeding and understand what we are dealing with. Feed at high tide. Use the scale. 12 pounds is the minimum. 20 on the full moon. Do not go to the rocks after dark without the headlamp. Do not look directly at it. Do not speak to it. It knows your voice already. It has always known your voice. I am sorry, Arthur. There was no one else. I put the letter down. My hands were shaking badly enough that the paper rattled against the tabletop. I told myself this was the writing of a woman in her 90s, isolated and possibly suffering from a dementia that her sharp exterior had concealed. Coastal people had superstitions. Old women had rituals. This was grief and loneliness and the mind turning in on itself. But the freezer was full. The logbook was meticulous. The amounts were precise. Whatever Edna had believed she was doing, she had done it with the discipline and consistency of someone who was very, very certain. I went to the window and looked at the water. It was midday, the tide low, the rocks exposed and dark and slick with weed. A line of foam marked where the surf reached at its highest point. Below that line, the rocks were bare. Above it, there was a patch of stone that was lighter than the rest, worn smooth by something that was not water. Something had been climbing up to that point, regularly, for a very long time. The worn area was roughly circular, about 8 feet across, and even from the kitchen window I could see the deep grooves scored into its edges. The next high tide was at 9:47 that evening. I checked 3 times. I did not feed anything that night. I locked the cellar door, double-checked every lock in the house, and sat in the upstairs bedroom with the lights on and the curtains drawn. I told myself I was being rational. There was nothing in the water that needed to be fed. My grandmother had been confused. At 9:30, I heard something. Not from outside, from below. The thrumming I had noticed the first night was louder now, more insistent, and it had a rhythm to it that I could not dismiss as pipes. It sounded like something dragging itself across stone. Slowly, patiently, moving from the back of the cellar toward the front. I sat very still and listened. The dragging continued. A pause. Then another drag, heavier, closer to the cellar door. The house itself seemed to tense around the sound, the floorboards tightening, the windows humming faintly in their frames. At 9:47 exactly, something struck the cellar door from the inside. Not hard, just once. A single, measured impact, like a knock. Then silence. A silence so complete that I could hear the blood moving through my own ears. I did not sleep that night. In the morning, I drove into Redfern. The general store was run by a woman named Claire, mid-60s, with sun-damaged skin and eyes that watched me with careful appraisal when I told her who I was. She knew. She said Edna had mentioned me. I asked her, carefully, whether Edna had seemed well in her last years, whether she had ever mentioned any routines related to the water. Claire was quiet for a long time. She wiped the counter with a cloth that was already clean. Then she said that Edna was the most reliable woman she had ever known, that she came into town every Thursday for supplies, always bought the same things, and that twice a month she placed a special order for fish from the wholesaler in Portland. Had done so for as long as Claire could remember. I asked how long that was. Claire said she had taken over the store from her father in 1989. Edna had been placing the order since before that. Her father had filled the same order before Claire had. I asked if she knew what the fish was for. Claire looked at me with an expression I could not read. It was not confusion. It was not concern. It was something closer to a warning, the look you give someone standing at the edge of a drop they have not yet noticed. She told me that some things along that stretch of coast had been the way they were for longer than anyone remembered, that the families who lived out on the points all had their responsibilities, and that those responsibilities were not discussed. She said her father had told her that, and his father had told him, and that was all she was going to say about it. I bought coffee and bread and drove back to the house. The cellar door was closed, the padlock intact, but when I knelt beside it, I could see scratches on the wood that I had not noticed before. Deep, parallel grooves, 4 of them, spaced about 3 inches apart. They were on the outside of the door. Something had been scratching to get in, or something that had gotten out had scratched on its way back. I went inside and opened the logbook to the most recent entries. The last feeding was dated October 1st, 4 days before Edna went to the hospital. The entry was shorter than usual. The handwriting was less steady. Fed. 12 pounds. It surfaced fully tonight. First time in years. Stayed at the rocks for a long time after I left. I could hear it from the bedroom. It was calling. There was one more entry, undated, written in a hand so shaky I could barely read it. Missed the 10th. In hospital. Arthur must be told. The schedule cannot lapse. 3 weeks is the longest it has ever gone. After 3 weeks, it comes to the house. Margaret's book says 4 weeks and it comes inside. I counted the days. Edna's last feeding was October 1st. She died on October 15th. It was now October 29th. 28 days since the last feeding. 4 weeks. The thrumming from the cellar had not stopped all day. It was constant now, a low vibration I could feel through the soles of my shoes. The house seemed to resonate with it, the windows buzzing faintly, the dishes in the cupboard shifting against each other with tiny ceramic whispers. I went back to the cellar. This time, I went further. The passage at the back narrowed until I had to turn sideways to fit. The walls were wet, and the stone was not granite, but something darker, almost black, and smoother than any natural formation I had seen. The passage descended at a gentle angle, curving to the right, and my flashlight beam seemed to weaken the deeper I went, as though the darkness here was thicker, more resistant to light. The walls bore marks. Not scratches, but carvings, old and deliberate. Shapes that might have been letters in a language I did not recognize, interspersed with images I could read more clearly. A coastline. Water. Something in the water, rendered in simple lines but unmistakable in its proportions. It was long and sinuous, with too many limbs, and where its head should have been, there was instead a cluster of shapes that resembled, more than anything else, a crown of fingers. The passage opened into a small chamber. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of water that did not seem to have a source or a drain. In the center of the chamber, on a stone shelf that had been carved from the bedrock, was a book. It was not a modern book. It was bound in something dark and stiff that I did not want to identify. The pages were thick, handmade, and covered in writing that alternated between English and something older. The English portions were dated, the earliest from 1847, in a hand identified in the margin as Margaret Holloway, my great-great-grandmother. Margaret's entries were not like Edna's careful logs. They were desperate. She wrote about the thing in the water, the way you write about a terminal diagnosis, with forced calm that fractured at the edges. It has been here longer than the town, longer than the people who were here before the town. The natives fed it. They told my grandfather's generation. They warned us what would happen if it went hungry. We did not believe them, and then Thomas Beale stopped his feedings in the winter of '44, and by spring his house was empty, and the rocks below his bluff were stained with something that the rain would not wash away. I read for a long time in that chamber, crouched in the shallow water with the flashlight balanced on my knee. Margaret documented what she knew. The thing lived in the deep water off the coast. It was old. It was large, though she had never seen more than a shadow of it. It required feeding at regular intervals, synchronized with the tides and the moon. In return, it did not come ashore. That was the arrangement. That was the word she used. Arrangement. The feeding families were positioned along the coast at intervals of approximately 3 miles. Each family maintained its own section. If a family failed, the thing would come to shore at that point. It would feed itself. And what it fed on, when it fed itself, was not fish. I closed the book and left the chamber. The passage behind me was darker than it should have been, the flashlight beam thinning to a pale thread that barely reached the walls. I walked quickly, my shoulders scraping the wet stone. I did not run because I was afraid that if I started running, I would not be able to stop. Back in the kitchen, I looked at the clock. It was 4 in the afternoon. The next high tide was at 10:12 in the evening. I had 6 hours. I spent those hours doing what any rational person would do. I checked the cellar for gas leaks. I searched the house for signs that Edna had been in contact with others who shared her delusion. I called Haskell, the lawyer, and asked about the covenant, and he told me, after a long pause, that it was old, pre-colonial old, attached to the land itself. He said I should speak to the Historical Society if I wanted records, but that most people who inherited those properties simply continued doing what their predecessors had done. I called the county records office and asked about properties along the coast road. The clerk was helpful until I mentioned the specific stretch near Edna's house. Then her voice changed, became clipped and formal, and she told me that the records for those parcels were in a restricted archive, and I would need to submit a written request. I asked what made them restricted. She said she did not know. She was lying. I could hear it in the careful flatness of her tone, the way someone sounds when they have rehearsed an answer many times. I asked Haskell directly. Did he believe there was something in the water? He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said that he had lived in Redfern his entire life, and that in 63 years he had never once gone to the shore after dark, and that he had never needed to ask himself why. At 9:30, I went to the cellar. I put on the rubber gloves. I weighed 12 pounds of fish on the bathroom scale. I put on the headlamp and carried the fish in a plastic bucket down the narrow path that led from the bluff to the rocks below. The tide was coming in. I could hear it before I could see it, the water advancing over the stones with a sound like breathing. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough to see by, and the headlamp threw a cone of yellow light that made the wet rocks gleam like black glass. The path ended at the flat shelf of stone I had seen from the kitchen window. Up close, the worn patch was about 8 feet across, polished to a dull sheen by years of contact with something heavy. At the edge of the shelf, closest to the water, the grooves were deeper than I had imagined. Not scratches. Channels, worn 3 inches deep into solid rock, as though something had gripped the edge of that shelf thousands and thousands of times. I set the bucket down. Edna's instructions had been simple. Place the fish on the shelf. Step back. Do not look directly at it. Do not speak. I upended the bucket. 12 pounds of cod and haddock spilled across the smooth stone. I stepped back to the path. I turned off the headlamp because it seemed wrong to leave it on, though I could not have explained why. The darkness was total. The moon was behind clouds, and the house lights did not reach this far down the bluff. I stood with my back to the rocks and listened. The water was still advancing. Slap and hiss against stone. Slap and hiss. And then, beneath that rhythm, another sound. Something large displacing water. A slow surge, like the wake of a boat, but there was no boat. The surge pushed up against the rocks, and I felt the spray on the back of my neck, warmer than it should have been. Then the feeding sound, wet and heavy and deliberate. Something was on the shelf behind me, and it was eating the fish I had left. I could hear the crunch of bones, the wet tearing of flesh. I could hear what I can only describe as breathing, except it was not like any breathing I had ever heard. It was deeper, slower. It sounded like something very large pulling air through passages that were not designed for air. I stood with my eyes closed and my fists clenched at my sides, and I did not turn around. Every instinct in my body told me to run. My legs would not move. The feeding lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then the sound stopped. The surge came again, pulling away from the rocks this time, and I heard the water close over something enormous. The displacement alone told me it was larger than anything I wanted to imagine. Then silence. Just the tide and the wind and my own breathing, which was ragged and shallow and nowhere near enough. I climbed back to the house on shaking legs. I locked every door. I sat in the kitchen and wrote my first entry in a new logbook that I found in Edna's desk drawer, blank and waiting. October 29th. High tide, 10:12 in the evening. Waning crescent. Fed. 12 pounds. My grandmother's handwriting had been small and precise. Mine was large and unsteady, but the words were the same words she had written, the same words Margaret had written before her, going back almost 200 years to a covenant made with something that had no name. I should have left. I know that. I should have driven back to Connecticut that night and never returned. But I kept thinking about Thomas Beale and his empty house and the stains on the rocks that the rain would not wash away. About what happens when the feeding stops. The next day, I drove into town and placed Edna's usual order with the fish wholesaler in Portland. I stayed through November. The feedings became routine in the way that all terrible things become routine if you survive them long enough. Every 7 to 10 days, 12 pounds. 20 on the full moon. I followed the schedule Edna had established, and I did not deviate. The thrumming in the cellar quieted. The sounds at night diminished. Whatever was in the water seemed satisfied with the arrangement, but small things kept me from settling into complacency. The worn patch on the rocks changed. Not dramatically, but I could see new grooves appearing at its edges, fresh scratches in the stone where something had shifted its grip. It was adjusting its position, moving its resting place slightly closer to the path. One night in mid-November, I came down to the shelf and found a dead seal. Not torn apart, not half-eaten. Laid out neatly on the smooth stone with its flippers folded against its sides, as though it had been placed there by hands. Its eyes were open, and its mouth was closed, and there was not a mark on it. Just dead. Arranged. I left the fish beside it, and went back to the house. By morning, both the fish and the seal were gone. The following week, I went back to Margaret's book. I had been avoiding it, the way you avoid a medical report when you already suspect what it says. But the dead seal had shaken me. That level of deliberation, of presentation, suggested an intelligence I did not want to acknowledge. A creature that simply eats does not arrange its kills in neat displays. Something that leaves gifts is thinking about the recipient. Margaret had documented the gifts. Her entries from 1851 described similar offerings. Driftwood carved into shapes by the current and deposited on the shelf. shells arranged in patterns. Once, a gold coin so old that the face on it had been worn smooth by the sea. She wrote that her mother had received the same kinds of offerings and had warned her never to take them. Taking a gift, her mother believed, deepened the bond, made the arrangement more personal, harder to break. I thought about the sea glass on my windowsill. I had taken it without thinking. I had carried it into the house and set it on the shelf above the sink where I could see it while I washed dishes. It caught the light in the mornings, that deep ocean blue, and I had found it beautiful. I put it back on the rocks the next treating night, but by morning it was on the windowsill again. The windows had been locked. Thanksgiving came and went. I cooked nothing. I ate a sandwich at the kitchen table and listened to the wind and the distant surf and the thrumming that never quite stopped, even on calm nights. I called no one because there was no one to call. For the first time, the silence of the house did not feel like loneliness. It felt like proximity. Something was listening with me. The week after Thanksgiving, I explored the rest of the cellar more carefully. Beyond the second freezer, the passage continued for another 30 yards before ending in a wall of natural stone. But there was a gap at the base, maybe 18 inches high, through which cold air flowed steadily. I lay on my stomach and shone the flashlight through the gap. The beam disappeared into a space so large that the light simply faded before finding a wall or ceiling. I could hear water moving in there, not the seep of groundwater, but the slow, heavy displacement of something enormous shifting in a flooded cavern. The smell that came through the gap was overwhelming. Salt and musk and something underneath that I can only compare to electricity, the ozone scent you get before a lightning strike. It was the smell of the thing itself concentrated in its resting place. I inhaled it, and my marked hand, the one that would later bear the tendril's touch, began to tingle. I backed away from the gap and did not return to that part of the cellar. But I dreamed about the cavern, 3 nights in a row, the same dream. I was swimming in black water, deeper than any human could survive, and the pressure was not crushing me, but holding me, the way a hand holds something precious. Below me, shapes moved in the darkness, shapes so large they had their own gravity, and I could feel them breathing in their sleep. Slow. Vast. Patient beyond any human concept of patience. And above them, circling, the one that was awake. Watching me with its crown of mouths and eyes while I floated in water that should have killed me, but instead felt like home. I woke from those dreams with the taste of salt on my tongue and a warmth in my chest that took hours to fade. In late November, the sounds changed. The thrumming beneath the house was quieter, but it had been replaced by something else. A sound I could only hear when the house was completely still, in the dead hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. It was a tapping, slow and irregular, coming from the walls, not the cellar. As though something was moving through the space between the outer clapboards and the interior plaster, moving up from the foundation, testing the structure of the house itself. I told myself it was mice. I set traps. The traps were undisturbed. The tapping continued. In early December, I broke Edna's rule. I brought the headlamp to a feeding and left it on. The fish was already gone from the shelf. The channels at the edge of the stone were wet with something thicker than seawater, viscous and dark, catching the light with an oily sheen. And at the edge of the headlamp's reach, just barely within its circle, I could see the water roiling in a way that was not caused by waves. Something was just below the surface. The water bulged upward, dark and smooth, and within that bulge I could see movement. Not one shape, but many. Limbs or tendrils or something for which I had no word, sliding over each other in slow coils just beneath the skin of the water. And at the center of that mass, rising slightly above the surface, something that might have been a head. It was smooth and dark and featureless, except for a cluster of shakes at the top that I initially took to be growths or barnacles. But they moved. They flexed and extended and curled, each one independently, and I realized they were not growths. They were sensory organs, or mouths, each one glistening in the lamplight like a wet opening flower. One of them turned toward the light, toward me. I switched off the headlamp and stood in the dark, breathing in shallow gasps. It did not leave immediately. It stayed at the surface for a long time, and I could feel something coming from it. Not heat, not cold. a pressure against my thoughts, like a hand pressing on the outside of a window, testing the glass. When it finally submerged, the relief was so intense that my knees buckled and I sat on the wet stone and stayed there until the tide went out. That night I wrote, "Saw it. God help me, I saw it." I went to Margaret's book again the next day, looking for any mention of what happens when the feeder looks directly at it. She had warned against it in the same terms Edna used, but buried in an entry from 1863, she described a night when she had looked accidentally, when the moon came out from behind clouds at the wrong moment. She wrote that its gaze had a weight, that when the sensory organs focused on you, you could feel it pressing against the inside of your skull, not painfully, but insistently, the way water presses against a dam. She said it took 3 days for the feeling to fade, and that during those 3 days, she dreamed of the ocean floor. She did not describe the dreams. She simply wrote that she understood now why her mother never slept well. I understood too. Since the night I had used the headlamp, my sleep had changed, not worsened exactly, just deepened. The dreams were vivid in a way that ordinary dreams are not, with textures and pressures and temperatures that stayed with me after waking. I dreamed of water so deep that sunlight had never touched it, of currents that moved through the dark like rivers of cold, of vast shapes resting in crevasses carved into the bedrock of the continental shelf, and always, circling above those shapes, the silhouette of the one that was awake, the one that knew my name. The feedings continued through the winter. I fell into the rhythm of it, the way you fall into any routine when the alternative is unthinkable. The horror faded into something duller and more manageable, like a chronic pain you learn to carry. I rose. I ate. I read. I maintained the house. And at the appointed times I carried fish to the rocks and stood in the dark while something ancient and incomprehensible fed at my feet. Christmas passed. I did not put up a tree. There was no one to see it. But on Christmas morning I found something on the kitchen windowsill that had not been there the night before. A piece of sea glass, dark blue, worn perfectly smooth, placed precisely in the center of the sill. The window had been closed and locked. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my fingers. It was warm. The fishing boats that went out from Redfern gave my stretch of coast a wide berth, a quarter mile at least. I watched them through Edna's binoculars and saw how they cut their engines when they reached an invisible line and drifted, nets raised, until they were passed. The fishermen did not look toward the shore, not once. Claire at the general store stopped asking how I was settling in. She filled my orders and nodded when I paid and said nothing about Edna, or the house, or the water. The silence around the subject was absolute. The entire town knew. They had always known, and they maintained their own silence, the way I maintained the feeding schedule, because the alternative was something none of them wanted to consider. In January, I found a second freezer in the passage behind the cellar. This one was older, unplugged, and empty, but the inside surfaces were scored with the same parallel grooves I had seen on the cellar door, 4 marks, evenly spaced. Something had been inside that freezer, and it had not been fish. I thought about the empty house of Thomas Beale, and I closed the freezer and did not open it again. Also in January, I made the mistake of skipping a day. Not a feeding, just a day when I did not go outside at all. A snowstorm had locked the coast in white, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below, and I spent the entire day in the kitchen with the wood stove going, reading one of Edna's novels and drinking coffee. A normal day. A human day. That night the thrumming came back. Not the steady background pulse I had grown accustomed to, but something more urgent, a vibration that rattled the windows and made the floorboards hum beneath my feet. It lasted for hours, building in intensity until the dishes in the cupboard were chattering against each other and a glass on the counter walked itself to the edge and shattered on the floor. At 2 in the morning, I heard something I had never heard before. A sound from outside, from the direction of the bluff, low and resonant, somewhere between a foghorn and a whale's call, but deeper than either. Deeper than anything I had heard in my life. It passed through the walls of the house as though they were not there, and I felt it in my teeth and my spine and the hollow spaces behind my eyes. It was calling. Not in words, in pure need. I put on my coat and my boots, and I went to the bluff in the dark and the snow. and I stood at the top of the path and looked down. The water was black and roiling despite the stillness of the air. Something was at the surface, close to the rocks, and in the dim light of the snowfall, I could see the tendrils reaching up over the shelf, searching, patting the stone the way a blind person's hands move across a table, looking for something that should be there. It was looking for me. It had noticed my absence. One missed day, not even a missed feeding, and it had come to check. I went back inside and did not skip another day. Every morning after that, I walked to the bluff and stood at the top of the path for 5 minutes, letting it know I was still there. I do not know how I knew that would work. I simply knew. February was the hardest month. The days were short and gray and identical, the light arriving at 7 and leaving by 4, and the hours between were filled with a silence that seemed to have texture, a weight that pressed against the windows and made the rooms feel smaller than they were. I read Edna's books. I walked to the bluff and back. I maintained the house with a care that bordered on compulsion, tightening hinges and oiling locks and sweeping floors that were already clean, because the routine was all that separated my days from each other. The storms came in relentless succession, and the feedings during storms were dangerous. The path was slippery, the waves unpredictable, and twice I nearly lost my footing on the rocks. I developed a system. Rope anchored to iron stakes driven into the bluff, giving me something to hold on the worst nights. Heavy boots with metal studs for grip. The headlamp, though I kept it pointed at the ground and never at the water, not again. But missing a feeding was not an option. Not after what I had read. Not after what I had heard. Not after the night in January when it had called to me from the water because I failed to appear at the bluff for a single day. On the night of March 12th, during a worst storm of the season, I lost more than my footing. I had the bucket. 20 pounds for the full moon. The rain was horizontal, driving into my face so hard I could barely keep my eyes open. The path was a stream of runoff, and the rocks were glazed with ice where the spray had frozen. I made it to the shelf, set down the bucket, and reached down to empty it. My foot went out from under me. The bucket tumbled over the edge and into the churning water. 20 pounds of fish, gone! I lay on the shelf, winded and bruised, my cheek pressed against the smooth stone. The water surged up around my legs. Warm. The Atlantic in March is cold enough to kill in minutes, but the water that touched me was warm. And in that warmth, I felt something brush against my ankle. Not the current. Something solid. Something that wrapped once, gently, around my leg and held for a breath. 2 breaths. 3. And then released. I scrambled up the path so fast I tore the skin off both palms on the frozen rock. In the house, shaking, I checked my ankle. There was a mark. A red band around the skin, perfectly even, like a bracelet drawn in irritation. It was warm to the touch, and it did not fade for 3 days. It had touched me. After months of maintaining the distance, the careful ritual of food and darkness, it had made contact. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake that night and every night after, was that the touch had been gentle. Not aggressive. Not hungry. Curious. The way you might touch something you had been watching for a long time and had finally decided to approach. It knew me. Edna's letter had said so, and I had dismissed it as paranoia. But it knew me. It had lured me through the rhythm of my footsteps on the rocks, the specific chemistry of my sweat in the salt air, the sound of my breathing in the dark. I was not just a feeder to it. I was a companion. The latest in a line of companions stretching back almost 2 centuries. And it was becoming attached. The full moon in April fell on a Thursday. I prepared the 20 pounds of fish and went to the rocks at high tide. The night was clear, the moon enormous and white, casting shadows so sharp they looked painted on the stone. I could see the water clearly for the first time in months. It was calm, mirror flat, except for the tidal movement, and in the moonlight it looked like hammered silver. I placed the fish on the shelf. I stepped back. I waited. It came from the deep water with a sound I had never heard before. Not the usual surge, something closer to a song, if a song could be made of pressure and vibration rather than notes. It resonated in my chest, behind my ribs, in the marrow of my bones, low and sustained and full of something that I can only describe as recognition. It surfaced fully. The body stretched from the rocks to a point I could not see, 50 yards offshore at least, and it was as wide as a car. The skin was dark, not black, but a deep blue-gray, and it moved with internal motion, things shifting beneath the surface. Muscles or organs, or something else entirely, coiling and uncoiling in slow ways. The limbs extended from the body in clusters, each one thick as my arm at the base, and tapering to points that were almost delicate. They moved independently, tasting the air, touching the rocks, curling and uncurling with a rhythm that matched the pulse I had felt through the cellar floor all those months. And the head, rising from the water on a neck that was too flexible, too long, bending in places where no vertebrate could bend. The cluster at the top flexed outward like a flower opening, each organ glistening in the moonlight, and I understood then that they were not mouths and they were not eyes. They were both. Each one could see and taste and speak, and every single one was pointed at me. I stood on the path. My hands hung at my sides. I had forgotten to breathe. It moved closer. The tendrils reached the shelf, found the fish, and the feeding began. But this time it was unhurried, almost ceremonial. The whole time, the cluster at the head remained fixed on me, watching, tasting the air between us, reading something in me that I could not name. One tendril extended past the shelf, past the high water mark, up the path, over dry stone, toward me. It moved slowly, giving me time to retreat. I did not retreat. It touched my hand. The tip of the tendril, smooth and warm and dry despite the water, pressed against my palm, and in that contact I felt something I was not prepared for. Its mind, not thoughts, not words. Something older than language. An awareness so vast that my own consciousness felt like a candle flame next to a bonfire. It was old. Older than the coast. Older than the water in its current form. It remembered a time when the land was different, and the sky was different, and the things that lived on the shore were not human, and it had fed on them too. But it also felt something else. Something that surprised me. And surprises me still, now, as I write this in the kitchen, with the tide coming in. It felt lonely. The tendrils withdrew. The body slid backward into the water, with barely a ripple. The head submerged last, the sensory organs folding inward, closing like a fist. The water went still. I stood on the path for a long time. The mark on my palm where it had touched me was warm and tingling, and it has not faded since. That warmth changed everything. Not the feeding, not the logbook, not Edna's letter. The fact that it touched me and left a mark that will not heal, and that sometimes, late at night, pulses. The mark was not a wound. It was a connection. A thread between my nervous system and whatever passed for its nervous system, and through that thread I could feel it in the deep water. The way you feel a spider on a web by the trembling of the silk. I could feel when it was hungry. I could feel when it was calm. And, increasingly, with each passing week, I could feel when it was thinking about me. It thought about me often. The mark spread through April. Not visibly. You would see nothing on my skin beyond a faint redness. But the warmth extended up my wrist, along my forearm, into my shoulder. At night, when the house was quiet, and the tide was out, and the thing rested in the deep water, I could feel it breathing through the connection. Slow, and vast, and ancient. And sometimes, between one breath and the next, something else came through. Not an image exactly, the ghost of an image, projected through a sense I do not have the anatomy for. It showed me the ocean floor. The true floor, miles down, where the water is black and the pressure would crush steel, and things live that have never known light. It showed me the place where it rests between feedings, a crevasse in the bedrock that descends deeper than the ocean itself, down into the hot stone beneath the seabed. And it showed me that it is not alone down there. There are others in that crevasse. But they are sleeping. They have been sleeping for a very long time. It is the only one that is awake. It has been awake for centuries, watching the shore, tending its arrangement with the families who feed it, keeping the others from waking. That is the part I keep returning to. It is not just a predator maintaining a territory. It is a guard, or a shepherd. The others in the crevasse are larger, much larger, and if they woke hungry, without someone to manage the transition, the feeding would not be measured in pounds of fish. My grandmother knew this. Margaret knew this. Every feeder going back to the original covenant knew this. They were not just preventing a single creature from coming ashore. They were preventing it from abandoning its post. The arrangement is not a threat. It is a leash. And I am holding the other end. I am writing this in May. I have been here 7 months. The house no longer feels like Edna's house. It feels like mine. The routines are mine. The logbook is mine. The path to the rocks, repaired now with fresh concrete, holds the imprint of my boots the way it once held hers. I have placed a new order with the wholesaler, double the usual amount. I have winterized the house for the next season. I have repaired the path to the rocks with concrete anchors so I will not fall again. I have started a second logbook because the first is nearly full, and I write in it with the same small, precise hand that Edna used, because precision matters when you are keeping something alive that keeps everything else asleep. Some nights I sit in the kitchen after a feeding and I can feel it settling back into the deep water, descending through layers of cold and pressure to the crevasse where the others sleep. And as it descends, it sends me images. Not deliberately, I think. The connection leaks. I see the sleeping shapes in the crevasse, their bodies coiled around each other in configurations that my mind cannot hold for more than a few seconds before it slides away. They are dreaming down there. I do not want to know what they dream about, but the one that is awake, the one I feed, it does not dream. It watches. It has watched for so long that watching is all it knows, and the feedings are not just sustenance. They are proof that the surface still remembers, that someone up here still honors the old agreement. I think that if it ever believed the agreement was broken, truly broken, and not just delayed by a death or a storm, it would stop watching, it would stop guarding, and it would let the sleepers wake. I have also written a letter. It is in the drawer beside my bed, next to the logbook, and a pair of reading glasses, and a tube of hand cream. The letter is addressed to no one, because I have no heir. But Haskell the lawyer knows about the covenant, and Claire knows about the fish orders, and the house will pass to someone eventually. The letter explains the schedule, it explains the amounts, it explains the rules. And at the bottom, in the steadiest hand I can manage, it says, what Edna said to me, and what Margaret said to her daughter, and what has been said in every one of these letters for almost 200 years. I am sorry. There was no one else. Last night I went to the rocks for the regular feeding. 12 pounds, high tide, thin crescent. I set the fish on the shelf and stepped back. The surge came. The feeding sounds began. And then, before it submerged, one of its tendrils reached up and found my hand, the marked hand, and held it for a moment. The pulse in my palm matched the pulse in its body. Two rhythms synchronizing, two solitary things touching in the dark. I stood on the rocks and held the hand of something that should not exist, and I listened to the water, and I did not pull away. For a long time there was no sound except the tide and the wind and the two of us breathing. Its breathing was slow and oceanic, mine was shallow and fast, but after a while they found a rhythm together. Something like peace settled over the rocks, and I understood that this was what the arrangement had always been building toward. Not just feeding, not just obligation, something older and stranger and closer to what the word covenant actually means. A promise kept in the dark, between two things that have no one else. This morning, I woke to a sound I had not heard before, knocking. Not from the cellar, from the front door. 3 slow, deliberate impacts, spaced evenly apart. I went downstairs and opened it. There was no one there, but on the doorstep, placed carefully in the center of the mat, was a stone, black and smooth and shaped like a human hand. The last gift it had left me was a stone with an open palm. This one was different. The fingers were curled, making a fist, or holding something invisible, or beckoning. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table next to the logbook. I made coffee and sat down and looked at it while the morning light came in through the salt-crusted windows. The stone was warm. It is always warm. The next high tide is at 8:17 tonight. I will be there. I will always be there now. Not because I am afraid of what happens if I stop, though I am, deeply and constantly in a way that has settled into my bones like the cold that never quite leaves this coast. I will be there because something in the deep water knows me and waits for me, and in the vast darkness of its ancient mind, I am the only point of warmth. And because last night, just before it released my hand, I felt something through the connection that I have not felt from another living thing in a very long time. Gratitude. The tide is coming in. I can hear it from the kitchen. The slow advance of water over stone, patient and rhythmic and endless. And beneath it, if I press my marked hand flat against the table and close my eyes, I can feel the pulse, steady and deep and waiting. It is always waiting.